heard people say that they admire about your dad?
A lot of my friends think that it's cool that he went to good colleges. He went to Cornell and Harvard, so they think that's really cool. And they like that he's really involved in our town and our school.
Yeah. Right. And so, as you've heard your mom and your dad talk about things they hope for you and your brother, what are a couple of things that you think, this is a big deal in my family and I want to pay attention to it? What would that be?
A big deal.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think they want us to put the most effort into our school and work really hard, and they want us to go really far in life.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great.
Maybe less work.
Let's hear it for Camille. A future John Wesley Fellow. All right, so I'm going to let you hold the mic, Ian, and we'll get started here. So I'll just add a couple of things. One is I've gotten to know Ian in a number of different ways through work in the foundation world and the philanthropic world, partly because he works at American Enterprise Institute, which is a public policy think tank, do tank, that brings together scholars from a variety of perspectives to develop ideas for best thinking on policy that will impact people's lives in many different kinds of ways. If you aren't familiar with AEI, it's a great group. But we've also, I've heard Ian speak at a number of occasions, a number of places, and recently got a copy of his book on agency, which is becoming a best-selling book. It's a really outstanding book. I highly commend it to you. And we'll talk a little bit about that probably tonight, but I just admire and appreciate that he's helped by sharpen and contributed to my own thinking about ways to frame and come at particular issues. And so as we talked at a recent meeting that we were both at, and he was willing to be a part of this, not his normal audience, but an audience that he has a deep appreciation and commitment for. I thought it'd be fun for us. And as we talked about tonight, rather than doing a lecture or a talk, we thought that we would just do kind of interview style, be a little bit more relaxed tonight. So I'll ask 2 or 3 questions to get us rolling, and then you may ask some questions as well that you want to ask. So, Ian, maybe to start, if you could just talk about, because you talk about 4 pillars in the agency book. Would you say a word about those 4 pillars and why you focused in on those?
Yeah, thank you, Sonia. Let me step back and first of all, it's so wonderful to see my beautiful daughter in that context, because that was all impromptu. Thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, in addition to my work at the American Enterprise Institute, which is quite incredible to have the opportunity to work there, it's a think tank, and I really like to not only work on policy and research, but also understand what happens in the real world. There's often a disconnect between the people who are crafting policy or crafting these ideas in the safety of academia or in a Washington, D.C. think tank, but they have very little appreciation for what happens when you try to implement ideas on 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the South Bronx. And so, in addition to my work at AEI, as I mentioned earlier, I run schools. And for the last decade, I ran a network of elementary and middle public charter schools. We had about 2,500 kids in our network, pre-K through 8th grade, almost all low-income kids, almost all Black and Hispanic kids. And each year, when parents entered our lottery, we had about 200 open seats for incoming seats, but we had nearly 5,000 kids on our wait list each year. And these are districts where only 7% of the kids are graduating from high school ready for college, which is horrific numbers. And you know, the reason I run, and I just launched a new International Baccalaureate high school just this past August, because there's a paucity of high quality options. And ultimately, the reason that I want, the reason I run schools is I want our kids to know that they can do hard things. And I'm going to get to the 4 pillars.
Yeah.
And I say that because I feel we're in an environment right now where kids are hearing 2 very dominant narratives that undermine their belief that they can do hard things, that there are actually pathways to prosperity in their own lives, that there are pathways to flourish. And I call these 2 dominant meta-narratives what I call blame the system, and the other I call blame the victim. In the blame the system narrative, that's a view of, if I'm a young person growing up in America, there are these systemic forces based on my race, my gender, my class, that the system is just rigged against me. That what we experience today, that the terror that existed in the era of lynching, Jim Crow, segregation, it's just as bad today. There's a white supremacist lurking on every corner. Capitalism itself is evil, and that America is defined by these oppressive structures and systems and institutions. And obviously, if you're a young person hearing that over and over and over and over again, you start to lose your sense of agency, that you have the ability to overcome in that environment. But simultaneously, on the other side, there's this other narrative that I call blame the victim. And in that narrative, if you're not successful in this country, it's not America's fault. America's great. You're the problem. Somehow you have not pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps. You have not taken advantage of all these opportunities that exist in this great country. And again, it's very hard for a 7-year-old kid who may have been born into a struggling single-parent family, or they're not supported by a strong faith community, or they haven't had access to good quality schools. So it's really hard to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps if you're in that situation. But so between these blame the system and blame the victim narrative, I believe is very debilitating and robs young people of the very idea that they can be self-determinative of their own lives. And I felt that I wanted to offer a compelling and empowering alternative for young people to embrace a new framework that they could feel a sense of agency. And I've done this work now for long enough that I've seen young people who are in my schools or even in other institutions who are in struggling situations as they entered young adulthood, they sometimes recreated the same challenges, the same disadvantages in their own lives in young adulthood. And yet I saw other young people who were able to break the cycle. And so the question is, what made the difference? And in my observation, what made the difference was that the young people who were able to change their circumstance, to break their cycle of disadvantage, was that they had a sense of personal agency, where I define agency as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment. The force of your free will guided by moral discernment. So if you think of agency like a vector or velocity, velocity is not just speed, it's speed and direction. So if each one of us has agency or free will, where does moral discernment come from? Where does your ability to become morally discerning come from? And that's where I introduce my framework of free. Because the young people that I've seen be successful as they enter young adulthood, it's usually been that they were engaged with these 4 acronyms, or these pillars, which I call free: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. Where family, it's not about the family that you're from, it's about the family that you form. So if you're familiar with things like the success sequence, if you know this data where if a young person just finishes their high school degree, gets a full-time job of any kind, just so they learn dignity and discipline of work, and if they have children, marriage first. So that series of decisions, education, work, marriage, children, 97% of people who follow that set of decisions avoid poverty, and the vast majority enter the middle class. So those young people I've seen be successful have typically followed that framework. R for religion, despite the fact that religiosity is down in our country, and we see high levels of depression, loneliness, deaths of despair amongst young people. For young people who have a personal faith commitment, much lower levels of loneliness, much lower levels of depression. More engagement in the real world with people that love them, that are part of weekly rituals that they're gaining support. So family, religion, education, the kids that I've seen be successful have benefited from some kind of school choice or educational freedom. I run public charter schools in New York City. We offer a lifeline to parents who desperately want their kids just to have a shot at opportunity. If you're in a district where only 7% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, and your only choice is the same school that's been producing that set of outcomes, why do we expect down the road we're going to see much better outcomes for these kids? So that E for educational freedom, and the last E is for entrepreneurship. And when I say entrepreneurship, if you build a strong family foundation, or you have a personal faith commitment in religion, you've benefited from educational choice, usually that last E is entrepreneurship, meaning that you are a problem solver in your own life. It can mean work for sure, it can mean starting your own business, but most importantly, it means that you have enough of a foundation now that you've got the capacity to encounter adversity and overcome it. You have a moral code that you live by. And it's been my observation that this structure, family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship, is a framework that can help young people overcome the kind of adversity, I think, even that we saw today, but it's a framework that I'm hopeful that young people can say yes to, as opposed to the debilitating narrative that they're constantly being exposed to.
So one of the things that you talk, sorry, louder, can you hear me now? One of the things you talk about in the book is the observation that political movements or political things are taking the place of faith in some young people and in some adults' lives. Say a word more about that and just the point that you make there.
Yeah, so in the book I talk about the importance of a personal faith commitment, that young people are actually taught. And by the way, Christianity, Buddhism, I don't specify any particular religion, but the importance of young people having a moral code that they live by. What's been happening, though, certainly over the last few years, and John McWhorter has just written a book called Woke Racism, where he essentially describes critical race theory or anti-racism almost like a religion. Like there's a certain orthodoxy that you have to live by. And I know that there are professors in this room who almost to the point where if they're, and we just had a discussion about this at our table earlier this evening, and oftentimes it's about race, but even in the disciplining of a student of color, if something occurs, you may refrain from meting out this discipline because there's such an orthodoxy that if there is, for example, if there's a racial disparity on almost any outcomes, that must be due to structural racism, for example. And so if you have an idea, well, perhaps let's talk about incarceration or any other issue. Well, if you say, well, perhaps there are issues with the criminal justice system, but what if we also look at the explosion in non-marital birth rates within particular communities, or the lack of access to high-quality schools, and you bring up other explanations for why things may be happening, you could be excommunicated from your particular community because it's almost like a new religion has replaced religious, actual faith-based community. And so young people in particular are being sort of inculcated into this orthodoxy, which now you have to accept every tenet of, and it's particularly focused on race. And I think it's dangerous for our country that there's almost this sort of woke ideology that it's not that it's completely far off in terms of trying to address contemporary issues, but we get to the point where any idea that doesn't fully subscribe to the orthodoxy is trampled or canceled. I think that's very dangerous for our country.
You talk about 3 heroes that have been influential in your own thinking in your life. Can you tell us who they were and why?
Sure. Well, one is Martin Luther King, probably everyone's heard of. One is Marty Seligman, someone that probably, maybe some of you know. And then the last is Albert. Of course, I'm blanking on his last name right now. It'll come to it. But what tied these 3 men together was a belief in individual capacity. Martin Luther King I write about in the book, who we all know Martin Luther King's story best, but he talked about being a victim did not mean that you had to take on a personality of victimization. It's very important, and we talked earlier about what can the Black community learn from the Jewish community, even in the face of increased anti-Semitism. There's a sense that you can still determine your own course, and Martin Luther King very much, I think, part of the reason he was successful, regardless of what your opponent was doing to you, you had control over how you respond. And it's in your response that dictates your character. Again, this power of a moral code. Marty Seligman, positive psychology, someone who spent a lot of time thinking about self-efficacy, and under duress, how is it that people of all kinds are still able to have a future-facing orientation? That even in the face of all sorts of obstacles, you can still succeed. In the communities where I run schools, it is innumerable what the obstacles are that are in front of the kids that we're facing. But when they come into our school system, all we're talking about is the next 10 to 12 years of their lives and what they have the incredible opportunities to achieve. And Marty Seligman's philosophy really helped me think through how to create that future orientation in school. And then Albert Bandura, yes, of course, I couldn't forget that. He was actually one of the first psychologists in this whole arena of sort of positive psychology, even before it was called that. And his whole focus was self-efficacy. And he basically has this whole idea that your belief, essentially behavior, follows belief. And so if you believe that you have the greatest control over your own personal destiny, then it dramatically shifts how you approach life versus someone who believes that they're literally at the whim of some other set of forces. And to me, this is the great central debate happening in our country, particularly along racial lines. I mean, Dr. Daniels said earlier, the idea of reparations is an idea that's now bubbling. In my view, reparations would be incredibly dangerous for our country and even for the community of people that it's intended to help. But there's great debate on it, and I think it's worthy of debate. But we never want, or I certainly don't want, our young people to believe that they need to wait for some other government structure to make this decision as the thing that's going to liberate them from whatever challenges they may be facing in their own lives. And so this idea of self-efficacy is hugely important, but it doesn't come from nowhere. we have to have a deliberate approach in which agency is individually practiced but socially empowered. So that's why the institutions of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship are so crucial to help young people develop that sense of self-efficacy. So my charge is both to individuals to understand their individual power. Agency is a force of your free will, but guided by moral discernment. So it's a call to action for individuals to recognize your own individual power, but also a call to action to these other institutions, most notably faith-based institutions, to play your appropriate role too in reminding the rising generation that there is institutional responsibility as well as individual accountability that's guided by a moral code. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the importance of those forces.
So I'll ask one more thing and then want to open it up if you've got some questions what I'm talking about. Say a word more about mediating institutions and the role that that plays and kind of how you see that being enforced or being reinforced.
Yeah, so in many ways, family, religion, education, entrepreneurship is my sort of homage to mediating institutions. There was a book, I think in the 70s, called To Empower People. And it was around the time of, there was a lot of discussion around welfare reform, and that really heated up in the early 90s with Bill Clinton. But the whole idea was that to really achieve human flourishing, you really have to start at the core of what happens to young people. So if you think of human development as a round of concentric circles that have the most influence over human development, the very center, the force that has the greatest influence, you know, like my daughter Camille, over an individual's human development is their family. And then if you radiate out a little bit after that, you'd probably say your church, your school, your local community, and if you radiate out from that, you might have public policy, government, and if you radiate out from that, you might have media or popular culture. And so basically all these forces, all these different institutions, and this book, To Empower People, and lots of other research shows that it's these mediating institutions, the ones that have the greatest proximity to an individual. So that's why, free, it's not free, you know, it's not, I don't have a G in there for government. I've got family as the fundamental #1 institution that we need to invest in heavily if we really want to change outcomes for the rising generation. Faith and education, these are the things, in my view, that we're trying to solve via public policy or government intervention, often to play roles that family, religion, and education are attempting to solve. And I think it's a fruitless and, in my view, proven failure when we're trying to replace things like the importance of a father, or the importance of marriage, or the importance of strong educational choices within a given community, or the role of a strong faith community. These are just things that, in some ways, I think we've lost our imagination, that we just think government has to come to the rescue. And it's not that there is no role for government, but as we've seen again, what we saw today, we saw what happens when you've got government-sanctioned violence and murder. Well, those laws are gone now. And yes, there is definitely racism that has continued, but a lot of the structural barriers have been eliminated, which reveals that now we have to work on a lot more of the cultural norms and attitudes and behaviors, and that's a much more dicey and touchy topic. But I think that's exactly where the faith community can play a huge role. You have a moral authority to speak about a number of issues that we're debating in our country, but I often find that the faith leaders are absent from and sort of abdicated that responsibility.
Let's see if people have a couple of questions. And I can't see really well, so maybe speak up.
Got a question. I'm trying to put it together in my head. So yes, I think I very much agree that there needs to be some kind of middle way or middle ground between also wonder how you strike the balance of information like we learned today in the museum. Applying that, I'm thinking specifically about applying that within a higher education setting, a classroom like a class that I teach, when there's also active resistance about these true narratives that haven't been taught in these educational
No, it's a very fair question, and I grapple with this. If you may have noticed today in the exhibit, there were several references to the New York Times 1619 project, which, if you haven't read it, takes a view of the United States that the founding principles of the country were quote, false when they were written, that the country has, quote unquote, anti-black racism running in the very DNA of the country, and that the founding of the country was not even 1776, it was 1619, as you saw in the film. That was when the first slaves arrived in our country. And the 1619 project, first it was just a special magazine issue, but then they decided to go further and actually create a curriculum that embedded this, in my view, a view of American history that was very much focused on things like what we saw today, the lynchings, the Tulsa Massacre. There wasn't that much reference to it in today's session, but basically this very, in our view, narrative of the country, which was true, but in our view limited. So I joined with a number of other black scholars, Bob Woodson, Glenn Lowry, a number of other black scholars. Again, rather than just shouting in the wind and saying, this is bad, what's your empowering alternative? We always have to have something that people can say yes to. So we decided to create a new curriculum that, in our view, was a more expansive view of the African American experience in the United States. Because we should be telling the whole story, warts and all. So let's take, like for example, we have a unit in our curriculum on the Tulsa Massacre. There are 3 components in that unit. The first component actually talks about the incredible wealth that was built in Tulsa by the black community, Black Wall Street. How is it that this community was able to start businesses, build such wealth in these conditions that were far worse than what exists today? That's the first component. But our kids need to learn that. And then the second component of the unit talks about the Tulsa Massacre and this horrible, horrific event, all of the racism that was embedded, the jealousy, all of it in graphic and horrible terms, because our kids at a certain age should learn that too. But the third component of the unit talks about the rebuilding of the Tulsa community, predominantly by the black community. And so for us, we feel that's telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But it's an attempt to not cherry pick either the worst of American history, nor cleanse, and only choosing those heroic moments. And so that's how we're trying to resolve that issue of what you teach. And even in our slavery unit, we talk about the role, I mentioned this earlier, we talk about the role of black Africans in, again, that doesn't remove the horror